And this is a really interesting grave right here behind Arlington House. It says George Crook, Major General, United States Army, born 1830, died 1890. And he was active both in the Civil War and in the wars against the Native Americans. So it's pretty faded here, but it says at the top, War of the Rebellion, and it has basically his resume throughout the war. 1861, Colonel, 36th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and it continues down to 1865. And before I get to this, I'll show you what it says over here. Here it says Indian campaigns, 1852 and different places, and 1866. These are different Native American tribes, and it looks like places because it says Rogue River, Pitt River, but then further down it says Shoshones, Apaches, so it looks like a mix of places and tribes. Sioux, Cheyenne, Utes, Nez Perce, Apaches, 1886. So that's what he was doing during his career. And then here you have this huge relief. And we see there are Native Americans in the middle and white men on the sides. There are even Native Americans back in the trees over there. Quite some detail going on. So not everyone was sitting down, and you have a U.S. Army person in the back and horses. And the writing at the top says, Surrender of Apaches under Geronimo to General Crook in the Sierra Madre Mountains, Mexico, 1883. And I'll give you a little better look at the detail here. This is some pretty quality sculpting. Now, as you see, this is a pretty elaborate grave, and there are a couple others over here. You have one that looks like the Washington Monument. Just below it, you have a pretty kind of fancy looking cross here. And the ones we saw back that way with the American flag draped over it, and there are others here. And when you think of Arlington National Cemetery, you usually think of these small white headstones that are very close together. And you may be wondering, how are there graves here that look like this? And this is because back in the old days, there were no regulations about what they could look like. They could really be any kind of shape or size or color or design. And you even see that right in front of us, just in this one frame. So when you see graves that really look very different, that's how you know that it's an older part of the cemetery. And we are right behind Arlington House, which is pretty much where it all began. Now, well before the Civil War broke out, Robert E. Lee married into the family, and he inherited this property, and this was his home. He came up in the Union Army. Of course, before the Civil War, it was just the Union Army. And shortly before the Civil War broke out, Abraham Lincoln asked him if he would take over U.S. forces in this war that was sure to happen. Now, Robert E. Lee, he actually, in principle, opposed slavery, even though he was a slave owner himself. In fact, this building here off to the left, this is former slave quarters. And this has been turned into a kind of a little bit of a museum space. And there's a building just like it across from it, although it's hard to see from this angle. He was a slave owner, but in principle, he wanted slavery abolished. He was never comfortable with it. And this is pretty much the same situation with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. They opposed it, but they didn't know how to break free from it themselves. So Robert E. Lee was not enthusiastic about the upcoming war. He did not like that all these states were seceding, but his loyalties were deeper to the state of Virginia than they were to the United States as a whole. And he said that whatever Virginia does is what he will do. And then the day came where Virginia seceded. Robert E. Lee basically packed up and moved further south to join up with Confederate forces, and eventually became the leader of the Southern forces. He wasn't at the beginning, though. So, what happened then? He left, the house was empty, and the Civil War broke out. Now, Of course, we are in Arlington, Virginia. We are not in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is right over there. We can take a little walk down this way. So this was basically the first area that was captured by Union forces when the war broke out. And maybe you can see there in the center is the Lincoln Memorial. So that is how close Washington, D.C. is. There is the Memorial Bridge that links the Lincoln Memorial to here. So you can just imagine if Confederate forces set up cannons here, it would have been bad news for D.C. for that to happen. So it was really important to take over this area, and they did pretty much right away. And when that happened, Arlington House became a headquarters for the U.S. Army. So fast forward a couple years now to 1863, and a freedmen's village was established right around here. Now, this was a village for escaped enslaved people from further south. They would come up here to seek freedom. Of course, this is after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was a true working village. The same types of industry and life you would find in other villages is what was happening here. And there were about 1,000 to 1,500 people living here at a time. And this was supposed to be just temporary. The hope was that once the war ended and the North would win, they could be resettled elsewhere and have more normal lives. But the village actually continued on for about 30 years. And all in all, there were about 10 to 15,000 people who lived in the village. And that was right in this area here. This in front of us was Mrs. Lee's flower garden, and right in front of the garden there are graves of Civil War soldiers, Union Civil War soldiers. Now, it may seem strange that there are graves right in front of her flower garden, and it is strange, and there is a reason, and I will come back to that. But for now, I want to talk more about how this land became a cemetery to begin with. So as you'd imagine, during the Civil War, there was a huge need for cemetery space. Now, all the space in existing cemeteries in Washington, D.C. became full, and they needed space. Well, here you have this land that had belonged to Robert E. Lee, but he abandoned it, and it was taken over by the North. And so logistically, it just made common sense to make this place a cemetery. So that's one reason why it became a cemetery. Also, a man by the name of Montgomery Meigs, and I mentioned Meigs earlier with the grave with the flag over it, he was in charge of what happened with this space. And he said, let's make it a cemetery, one, for the reason I just mentioned, but also because he and others felt that Robert E. Lee had disgraced his country by abandoning the Union and heading south to join the enemy, to join the Confederates. And to make this a cemetery for Union soldiers was a way to restore honor to the property. So that was a second reason. But wait, there's more. There's a third reason. After the war ended, Robert E. Lee expressed interest in moving back to his old house. And this was not a popular idea with the powers that be. So one way to discourage him from moving back is to make the land a cemetery for the Union, who he fought against, who was his enemy in the war. And not only that, to really drive the point home, not just make the old plantation area a cemetery, but to really make it more personal for him by burying soldiers around the perimeter of his wife's former flower garden. So this is what you see here. Here is one. There are 26 graves like this planted right around the perimeter. Here is one. And you see here 1865. Jacob Ziegler, captain, looks like 5th Tennessee Infantry. And look how much space, or how little space there is between the back of his grave and the fence marking the beginning of the flower garden. And this isn't the only thing they did. In the back there, I will show it to you a little later, there is a tomb of unknown soldiers that contains the remains of over 2,000 unknown Union soldiers. And they also put that behind the flower garden. This was enough to make Robert E. Lee give up on wanting to move back, and he never did.